Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Broninski, and today I'm talking to Annette Kehnel, Chair of Medieval History at the University of Mannheim, and author of 2 books about sustainable practices within medieval Europe: The Green Ages, Medieval Innovations in Sustainability, and The 7 Deadly Sins, Human Knowledge for the Age of Crisis. We're going to be talking about the history of environmental theory and management in Western Europe, and why problems with mainstream thinking around economic development in the present day have resulted from ideas developed in 18th and 19th centuries.
This idea of sustainability would itself be the outcome of an efficiency thinking that in the early 18th century really got fashionable because everybody was concentrating on more efficiency and better output, more profit.
I began by asking Annette about her career and what she researched before she became focused on the history of sustainability.
I started with studying Celtic monasticism when I did my doctorate in Trinity on Clonmacnoise, which is one of the central monasteries in Ireland prior to the 12th century. Well, and from there I moved on then to being more and more interested in how communities organize themselves, what rules they give themselves. I came to think about maybe alternative forms and values and goals in communities and what stabilized and balanced different needs and capacities in the interaction between humans. Currently, I'm a visiting fellow at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, where we are a team of 8 fellows in a newly found Center of Advanced Studies, the Collegium St. Gallen, and we try to figure out what freedom means in the 21st century. Reinterpreting freedom is our great theme, and there are different people from different disciplines, from finance, social studies, political science, migration studies, and so on and so forth. So that's a very big challenge. And my part is the history, reinterpreting freedom in the long-term perspective. And their history can be really an eye-opener, I think.
Most of our audience will be able to think of the overlaps between those topics that you've mentioned, like community organizing and freedom and environmental issues. But what was the jump for you in reaching this research field that is quite focused on sustainability and environmental economics?
I think it was my students and my own children coming to age and the world they will be living in and they are living in. We are all living it at the moment. I mean, just look at the floodings in Asia at the moment, at the drought in many countries. And I started wondering, sustainability, it's by nature a historical term because it's about balancing out the interests of present generations and bringing them into some sort of harmony with the interest of future generations. So what can history contribute to that? That was the big question. We had this big movement, Fridays for Future in Germany. Well, we had it all over the world, but it was at the universities, very strong in Germany. And that made me thinking, so what can I as a historian contribute to the debate? And then came COVID, which brought it all down, but which also created new spaces of time because many conferences didn't take place. We couldn't leave the house. We had to reorganize the very daily routines of research and work. And that time for me was a chance to get to terms with all the seminars, lectures, and interactions with the student I had on the topic so far. So what came out was the book, which reorders topics like, for example, sharing economy in the past, which is something deeply rooted in traditional societies. You don't need to be a socialist or a communist to think about sharing economies. Benedictine monasticism is full of sharing and not owning things, but rather using them. Then I specialized on Franciscan history and the Franciscans, a mendicant order, a community that specializes on living in poverty as a community, not only as individuals, but also as a community. They didn't ban riches and capital and everything, but what they made was a big difference between debt and living capital, for example. And the debt capital was the problem in their eyes, whereas circulating capital used for the good of the society. And these theories are really amazing. I found histories and stories and narratives that would show us, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Sustainable acting is something that is deeply rooted in our cultural and even economic DNA, I think.
So to talk to you mainly today about competing histories and narratives and re-examining some of the default, almost mythological historical narratives that in a public context we've normalized. But before that, I wondered if there's a simpler question as well. I've noted down that in the introduction to the Green Ages, you put, as a historian, I can't help but notice how short-sighted we are these days. And just hearing you talk about thinking about future generations and locating us within this longer timeline, is there just an issue of people not having enough history as well, whichever history that might be? Do you think the social sciences and historians are not being given enough space in the conversation?
I think there is history around in the collective memory, which is in a way very blurred, one-sided and unreflected. One of the big obstacles for moving on and getting the transformations that we need to be getting them done is the idea that there is no alternative. Nobody wants to go back to the Middle Ages, and we see no alternatives because we are afraid of losing so much. So there is the fear of loss, which is a very strong incentive, and also the status quo bias that we've been doing things always like this, and that's why we can't do them differently. So we are stuck in a trap because we hang on to historical narratives that actually, if you look back, they are more than 200 years old. The question is really, how do we change collective memories? How do we change grand narrative, great meta-narratives in our collective awareness? And that's very, very difficult. I think the 19th century was very powerful in creating a narrative of progress, wealth, and growth, which have in a way then developed dynamics, especially after World War II and then in the 1980s. And it's very difficult to change these narrative patterns, because just think about it, if we now have the discussion, if you come forward with changes like getting rid of the combustion engine, people say, but other people in India or in Africa or in South America, they have a right to fly as well, or they have a right to drive cars and whatever. So we can't forbid the rest of the world to become as we are. And that basically is a status quo argument, because we do still expect that the whole world has nothing better to do than wanting to profit from the blessings of Western civilizations. In reality, I think all the profits go to the Western world anyway. And at the moment, most of them go to California. I think they have the second highest VIP in the world at the moment, because the profit making is one thing, but then in the name of distributing the blessings of progress and Western civilization is another one. Every so often we need new narratives, and I would like to contribute a little bit to forming them and bringing them to life. What I do not want is to go back to the Middle Ages. I think that's a very important history, and also thinking in alternatives is not about going back to the good old days. The point is acknowledging the great diversity we have seen and human societies have developed in terms of self-organization, in terms of economic thinking and dealing, in terms of how to distribute goods and how to share, and using that historical imagination to create and form ideas about potential futures.
That idea of regression and going back to something still plays into this fallacy you're outlining of a linear trajectory that you can only go backwards or forwards along, right?
Yeah, I sometimes talk of history as a study in historical diversity or a diachronic diversity. Today we study diversity in different societies, so on a synchronic level. And on diachronic, it would be the diversity in organizing societies in the past and taking ideas for future diversities.
I just wanted to pin down a little bit this point about how we're stuck in the 19th century. Could you outline some of the ideas that formalized in the Victorian period or in that period in Western Europe that we've stuck with?
The 19th century is really amazing because it presents us with so much confidence in the genius of the human race, especially the white race and also the male part of the white race. So it's the century of white men, really. And there the idea of progress to a better world is just overwhelming. And you have different movements or different developments and discussions that fabric this idea. The Darwin's theory of evolution. We could say it's misunderstood, but still it implies a linear development from nothing to grandeur. And then humans, even if they are latecomers in the evolution, they start in caves and then they go over Renaissance palaces and right into modern bathrooms. The 19th century was the century when flush water toilets were invented, and you have hygiene, and you have humans actually being in a position to subdue the rest of the world. And they are the peak of evolution. Even if Darwin didn't say that, the popular Darwinism or popular evolutionary theory made that. We always hear that evolutionary theory would debase humans because they are just part of nature. But in actual fact, what happened was rather than making us more humble and being part of the nature, the common image was humans are the peak of evolution. Homo sapiens is the ultimate goal of evolution. And in terms of self-understanding of humans, I think the Middle Ages were more realistic there. Nobody thought of him or herself as the peak of a development, a general development. We were all children of God. And some of us used to be higher or lower in social hierarchies. Humans in the Middle Ages were much more realistic in terms of being part of nature and being dependent on nature. They knew we can try to have an impact on the nature, but we will always be the losers. Whereas the 19th century was the century of the winners in Western societies. All the costs of these ideas were tragic. So evolution was one. And then, of course, Marxist ideas had the same linear development upward from an underdog society, slavery society, and then coming out to more developed free societies that tried to free themselves. And then finally, the end of suppression and proletarian society that is organized with itself, which is, again, a linear upwards moving. The whole is founded in Enlightenment ideas, humanity leaving the dark ages behind and then going into the light of rationality and progress. And then, of course, industrial revolution as well, because you suddenly discovered new energies and technology that multiplied the possibilities of human impact on each other, but also on nature, that fed this confidence in human. We made the world a better place for some, but for very many, we made it hell. So these are tales that have been formed in the 19th century and have been very efficient. And of course, we all profited. And you'd never go back to the Middle Ages. We are all grateful for dentistry. We are grateful for medicine, medical progress, women's right to vote and equality and so on and so forth. But the implications of progress have been delusionary because the wars we have been fighting in the 20th century were overdoing by far the cruelties that have been done before, also the persecutions that happened, and also suppression and the way we really used resources in the 20th century have been outdoing what we have done before by far. And there, the second half of the 20th century gets a special role with the invention of throwaway societies that mark another step of progress, because then we took the liberty to turn our planet into a global waste bin.
Yeah, and I think there's a case to say that women getting the vote or even lots of healthcare wins, like the change in narrative around smoking were not inevitable byproducts of capitalist developmental trajectory that society was on as a whole, and they were bitterly fought for. Do you think there's some kind of almost faith-like belief that we will get to 2050 and we will reach our net zero commitments and we will manage to do sustainable development and all of these other things, sometimes forgetting that things are always a fight and it could always go either way?
The age of enlightenment and then the age of science as it has been active in the late 20s and nowadays centuries. I mean, it's also the age of renter scientists to write the studies and do the studies you want. So pay scientists for writing referees that show smoking has nothing to do with your health. That has been a big backlash in our understanding of freedom in terms of scientific freedom, because scientists and academics are humans and they are corruptible as well. So if you pay them well enough, they write what you want to hear, which is tragic in a world where the scientific findings have a very big authority. I think they are much more important than what the popes or politicians say. Scientists could be the priests of the modern world, but they are corruptible as well. So you pay them. Naomi Oreskes' book about Merchants of Doubt, which has been a very good survey on the way that science has been bribed to bring the results and how the big oil and fossil companies, still down to today, so just put forward their profit-making and still paying good scientists to underscore what they do and what devastations they're doing.
One of the interesting things, through lines from your book, in my mind, is that you talk about quite a lot of examples of more sustainable management and organization and planning, but it's not always this idea that I think some people might have of environmental historical practice, where it's just kind of people doing things in the way they might do on their own in a kind of traditional way. It's actually quite, I don't want to say technocratic, but in a lot of your examples, you talk about kind of record keeping and guilds and planning or management. One of the interesting chapters that you had was on the history of forestry in Saxony. I wondered if you could outline some of that for us a bit, because you start by talking about how people often talk about Hans Carl von Carlowitz, this theorist from the early 18th century, as one of the earliest voices in theories of economic sustainability in relation to forestry. But you almost argue that when he published that was the turning point for forestry in Saxony becoming less sustainable. Could you talk us through it?
Hans Carl von Carlowitz, he's the founding father of sustainability. He wrote a book, Silvicultura Economica, on how to do sustainable forestry. The problem is, the book was the outcome of making sure that Saxony had enough wood for feeding its mines. And the mining industry was growing at the time in the Saxon forests. So Freiberg in Saxon, that was the big academy, the center of learning proper forestry and proper wood farming. The point is not that he was wrong. The point is that this idea of sustainability would itself be the outcome of an efficiency thinking that in the early 18th century really got fashionable, because everybody was concentrating on more efficiency and better output, more profit. And so the Silvicultura Economica of Hans Carl von Carlowitz, he was actually registrating that need and how to create a forest that produces as much wood in 30 years as it does today. The problem only was that with that thinking, one planted the idea that before Hans Carl von Carlowitz, forest keeping was bad. And the commoners who practiced shared forestries, that they were bad for the forests because they were not as efficient, because they didn't cut as much wood in the first place. But then if they cut wood, they would leave the land free and then have animals grassing in the forests for a year or so. So the dung would actually feed the ground, yeah. And then they would also use fire because the ashes would be good for the fertility of the ground. And only in the third year, they would replant trees, which of course is a time loss if you want to really make efficient forestry. And so the idea that grew with the efficiency concentrated sustainability of the 18th century was that ever before, humankind was exploiting the earth and exploiting the land and the forests and everything. And only with the invention of sustainability, we got clever enough to make careful use of resources. But quite the opposite was the case. The idea of sustainability grew only in a time when we began to be able to exploit natural resources in a way that hasn't been possible before. Actually, people have quite a lot of knowledge and cultural, practical knowledge about how to treat resources in a long term so that everybody who lives from the resource can actually feed on it. Which doesn't mean it was always nice, and there was exploitation before, but we weren't as efficient in exploiting our resources. I just think Karlovitz, he was a good one, but I think the context needs to be proper. Sometimes if you listen to colleagues in economics, they feed the story that until Karlovitz, we were exploiting the resources and then we began to be sustainable, but quite the opposite is the case. Sustainability became necessary when we started to exaggerate the way we exploited resources.
And you also talk about the case study of fishing practices in Lake Constance near what is now the Swiss-German border, where you talk about guilds, I think 16th century, kind of self-regulating resource use and them having their own quotas within the industry of how much you're allowed to fish in different places. And would you say that that was common in medieval Europe?
Well, Lake of Constance, actually, that's a very good example because a colleague of mine, Michael Zeheter, he's a historian at the University of Trier, and he worked out how medieval fishery from the late 13th century to the middle of the 18th century was organized at the Lake of Constance over generations, over centuries, without A, overfishing the common resource, B, without a central government that imposes rules, and C, without sustainability concepts. These people didn't know they were in a sustainable way. But the result was what we today call sustainable management of a common resource. And how did they do it? They organized themselves in a way. There was no private property at the Lake of Constance. There were only different stakeholders. The monastery of St. Gallen had fishing rights at the Lake of Constance. And then cities like Überlingen or Constance or other monasteries like Salem or the Bishop of Constance and so on and so forth. So all had rights to use the lake as a resource, and they would employ and pay fishermen or give the rights to professional fishers or less professional fishers. And actually, the ones who did the job, they met once a year and organized the way they would be fishing the following year. And for that, they would adjust the climate, the situation in the lake. How many fish do we have? Are there problems in a lack of fish or whatever? And how is the demand? How is the supply as well? And they would then adopt the rules of fishing to the relevant situation at the moment. Which means when there was a lack of fishing, they would actually enlarge the size of the meshes in their nets. So they would get less fish for this year, but next year they would have more. Today we call this internalizing externalities because they would internalize long-time effects of their economic decisions and behavior. This was not because they wanted to be sustainable. This was just a strategy of survival. And I think today we are in a similar situation. It's nothing to do whether we want to be sustainable or not. It's a question of strategies of survival in an age of changed conditions on a warmer planet with less water, with more drought, just a different environment. We can't avoid climate change. It will be coming, but it's mitigating the changing positions. And there we can make big progress if we remind ourselves more often that our ancestors were able to do that.
Both of these case studies play into this idea of the tragedy of the commons, or at least you use them as reasons to refute this theory. Some of our listeners might know what that means, but could you maybe explain?
Garrett Hardin, in the 1968, he published a paper. He was a biology, and he tried to understand how common management of resources cannot work. He actually was a good scientist, and he tried to highlight that the limitations on our planet actually make changes necessary. And he said the way we are treating our common goods, namely the atmosphere, groundwaters, the oceans, and so on, is not good. We have to change that. And that's why he invented this idea of the tragedy of the commons. If something is used by everybody, it will be misused by everybody, it will be neglected by everybody, and it would ultimately lead to the ruin of it. Now, this idea is very appealing to most of us because we just think of the tea kitchen in our offices, and we realize immediately, oh yes, he's right. Everybody wants to drink coffee, but nobody wants to clean up, to do the washing up or the repair or whatever. So yes, that's true, and so on and so forth. But obviously, this narrative is also stuck in our minds because we think, there is no alternative to private property. There is no alternative to central government. That's what Hardin said would be the solution. We need a strict government that forbids us to overuse resources. We need a strict government that forbids us to breed. Very important. He was very strong in favor of regulating demographic expansion. But what we discovered in the meantime is actually that the trust in the capacity of humans to regulate and organize themselves on a lower level, that has been much underestimated. And there is a woman, an economist, Eleanor Ostrom, who did studies on that and worked with the way fishing was organized in North America, crab fishing and lobster fishing, and how these communities organized their resource and the management of the resources within local rules and with communication amongst each other and so on and so forth. And she developed models for that. So she says managing the commons is something deeply rooted in human societies without top-down central government impositions. She's not just someone. She then got in 2008, I think, the Nobel Prize for her studies. So we can now say modern scientific resource has shown, yes, we can manage commons. Hardin, that's over half a century ago. That was old-fashioned research, So I think the trust in the capacity to manage commons be strengthened. And then I was very happy to find historical examples that more or less confirm what Eleanor Ostrom found out for late 20th century resource management in commons.
My thanks to Annette Kehnel for coming on the show and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. If you enjoyed this episode, there are links to Annette's books in the blurb, and do remember to subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, and check out our other content at landclimate.org. We've got one more episode before we take a break for the winter holidays, so do make sure to tune in 2 weeks' time. But until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.